Okay, afternoon everybody. I'm going to do the context lecture on Romeo and Juliet today. I'm going to be looking at marriage, I'm going to be looking at sexuality, I'm going to be looking at power, I'm going to be looking at masculinity, and I'm going to be looking at the place of the family as well as a few other things related to love in particular, okay? First of all, you'll all be aware of the fact that Shakespeare is an Elizabethan. That means he wrote during the time of Queen Elizabeth I. The play Romeo and Juliet was written during her lifetime. That's of quite a lot of interest because she was one of the most powerful monarchs in the history of Britain, and she was a woman, and she was an unmarried woman. So I think it is quite interesting that you think to yourself, at the time, whenever we were talking about gender, the most powerful, important person in England was a woman, and she was also a woman who chose not to marry. So Queen Elizabeth was called the Virgin Queen because she chose not to marry. The reality is she was far from being a virgin and took many lovers, actually, but that wasn't known to the general population. It's a very important time in terms of English politics, I need you to know, because there was a great, enormous battle in terms of religion between the Catholics and the Protestants. So I always want you to remember that that's going on. During the time of Queen Elizabeth, the Protestants win that battle, and the Church of England, started by her father, King Henry VIII, wins, and it becomes the main church. The Catholic Church becomes more or less illegal. And as I talk through today, I'm going to show you why you need to know that and why that's quite important, okay? So, as I said, she never married. She was very independent. She was a very highly educated woman herself, very fluent in quite a number of languages, including Latin, ancient Greek. She was somewhat of a religious scholar. So it was a time in which, in many ways, she sort of spearheaded the idea that women could be educated. But don't get too excited about that because, say, for instance, just like when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in England, that didn't necessarily mean that it was good for all women. It was just good for that main one woman, okay? I wanted you to know, in a famous speech in Tilbury, she made an extraordinary speech in which she said the following words: "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general judge and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field." What's interesting is that even Queen Elizabeth felt the need to talk about the fact that her female body was weak. So I want you to be sort of aware of the fact that even though you've got a queen in power, there's still quite a lot of misogyny. There's still the belief that women are weaker. There's still very much the teaching from the church that women are frail, that women are the weaker vessel, it says in the Bible. And therefore, Queen Elizabeth, in this very famous speech, claims, in a sense, to be a kind of man in drag. Elizabethan men. So obviously very, very different from women. Very much the head of the house, very much a patriarchal society, and a patriarchal society in the true sense of the word, that there would be one male head of the house. Now that's very important to us because we know that Montagues and the Capulets have a kind of masculinity about them, etc. Let's not forget that Romeo is actually going to be the head Montague. So when he renounces his house, he's renouncing responsibility to literally hundreds of people, because the man, the aristocratic man, was not only responsible for his immediate family, but his extended family and all of the servants. And you'll recall that this is still a kind of medieval system where there's still villagers and vassals. So the head of the family is an incredibly important position. The Renaissance, especially in Italy, is a very warlike time. And you will see if you go to Italy today that it's a series of castles, and knights in the area would fight each other. Therefore, things like masculinity, aggression, military prowess were still incredibly important. Even though it's the Renaissance, you mustn't forget to yourself that jousting was still popular, the idea of going on lances. So the idea of military, of martial valor, of warlike valor was absolutely integral. So when you're thinking about how Romeo, for instance, won't fight in the duel scene, I want you to think to yourself that's within the context of a martial society in which masculine honor is absolutely key. So when Romeo is referred to as a villain, which means a servant or the lowest of the low in the social hierarchy, I want you to think that's within the context of a society that prized male honor, in which dueling was almost inevitable in that kind of situation. Elizabethan women, as I said, were seen as inferior to men. Their wives in particular were expected to be obedient to husbands. That was in the Church of England wedding ceremony, and to this day it is in many wedding ceremonies where women, unfortunately, Kirsten, promise to love, honor, and obey their husbands. Now, within that context, we need to think about Juliet's female rebellion. We need to think about how Elizabethan audiences would view this. It's quite complicated, though, as I'll show you later in the lecture, because we're going to have what we call a fault line, in which there are conflicting values. It's not absolutely clear whose side they will be on, is what I'm going to be arguing today. As I'll say a bit more later, obviously marriage was predominantly there as a financial and a dynastic transaction. If you wanted to get wealthy as a man, you tended to marry a wealthy woman. It wasn't a society in which men went to work and tried to make lots of money. There was some of that as regards when we had voyages and whatnot, but the main way that you got ahead in life was through marriage. So it was absolutely a key financial transaction and therefore couldn't be left to children. And Romeo and Juliet is going to explore this. At the same time, as I said, there's an emerging culture of love that's coming in Elizabethan times. Okay? Family and home life depended on the skills of the woman in relation to good housekeeping, and the health of the family was determined by the ability of Elizabethan women to produce medicine from the herbs available to them. So I want you to see that a woman's role was still very domestic in those days, and that is, of course, is going to go on well into the 20th century. Elizabethan families, well, the father was responsible for the good name of the family and to protect the reputation of his wife and children. Reputation is absolutely key. And as we will see in Romeo and Juliet, the conflict is caused by an airy word. In other words, a throwaway comment, nothing significant, but it's enough to cause generations to fight each other. Now, I'm wondering, Oliver, whether Shakespeare sets the play in Italy in particular, because Italians had this reputation for being obsessed by reputation, as having very big egos and being prepared to fight. Of course, the English tended to represent the Italians as very hot-blooded people, as very passionate sexually and in terms of emotions and anger, etc. So I can't help thinking that it is sometimes worth mentioning that this play is not set in England, it's set in Verona, and heat is often referred to in Act 3, Scene 1, in the dueling scene. You'll recall that Benvolio and Mercutio are both in a bad mood caused by the heat. So I do think that there's a sense in which the Elizabethan English audience look upon the Italians as hot-blooded, as passionate, as maybe more irrational than the more phlegmatic Englishmen, calmer by nature. Types of Elizabethan love, and I'm going to go into these in more detail. I'm just going to look at this slide, and this is something that you can look at later. Elizabethan love itself was patriarchal, honor and name, not love. Yes, I think that this is true, that it was largely secular, largely unromantic. It was to do with filial obedience, doing what you're told as regards what your parents want. Property was at the center of it. Marriage pacts were made between families. They were also made to cause peace as well between warring families. Sometimes marriage would actually get rid of conflict. Now, the Petrarchan Lover, which you're going to talk a lot about, is something that occurs throughout the play. It is primarily a literary phenomenon, okay? It comes from the poet Petrarch, who wrote all of his sonnets to Laura, whom he never met. He only saw in church and then spent the rest of his life writing poems to them. So, of course, they were hyperbolic. They were filled with this elaborate poetic diction. They are based around a kind of vocabulary of pain and suffering and of disease and of warfare. The love, of course, is unrequited because it's impossible. In Petrarch's case, as I said, he never really gets to meet Laura. But this produces a kind of craze throughout Europe in which love is written about obsessively and it's seen as this form of terrible suffering, etc. But I want you to understand that it is merely a literary phenomenon. It doesn't actually happen in real life, which is why it's celebrated within sonnets, within these highly idealized 14-line poems. And that's going to be something that's very important in Romeo and Juliet. The Petrarchan lover was often seen as a posturer as well, as an actor, as somebody enjoying the role. And I think that that's something that we can see in Romeo and Juliet. Of course, there was a notion of physical love. Most wealthy men would have many mistresses or concubines. They would not be looking for sexual satisfaction within marriage. They would be looking for sexual satisfaction through maids, through concubines, through all sorts of other alliances. Physical love, of course, within the Christian church was looked at with suspicion. This is something that the friar raises suspicion about when he says, "These violent delights have violent ends," which you will recall is Andrew's favorite quotation, is it not? Yeah. Also in the play, we will see that the working class characters, like the nurse, like Peter, use a rich sexual vocabulary and actually speak very frankly and openly about sex, and I'll go into that a little bit later. So there are two types of very conflicting discourse in Romeo and Juliet, and we could see them as the language of tragedy. That's the high Petrarchan poetic language of love, which often revolves around very extravagant, hyperbolic, cosmic imagery, doesn't it? Suns and moons and stars and eternal love and Plato's idea of spiritual love. And then, of course, we get the other characters from below, the nurse and Peter, etc., who speak so, and Mercutio, interestingly, even though he's an aristocratic character, uses very common and low language to describe love. He uses terms like pricks, etc., refers to death, etc. So you have these two conflicting discourses about love that go throughout the play. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the whole idea of romantic love versus worldly reality. Now, remember earlier I said to you this marriage was largely about money, etc. However, I also want to point out that, especially in England, there's an emerging idea of love. And that's largely due to the Protestant church. Because the Protestant church actually teach that marriage must be based on love. So I want you to see that Romeo and Juliet, one of the ways of looking at it is to look at it as an exploration of the conflict between marriage for money and materialism and material gain and marriage for love and affection and companionship. Protestants argued, unlike Catholics, that Adam and Eve were the ideal couple and that God put them together for love and companionship. In Elizabethan times, however, the literature of love was largely, as I say, literary and idealistic. So we must be careful not to exaggerate this idea of love. It was still the case that marriage was largely about secular things. And the Petrarchan love that we read about in literature and poetry was largely fantasy and was largely literary. And I'm going to suggest to you when we first see Romeo and he writes about Dian's wit and how much he loves Rosaline, he is really the posturing Petrarchan lover. And I think he's more in love with language and more in love with the idea of love than he is with Rosaline, because he's very much a Petrarchan figure at that stage. Okay. Courtly love, or fin amour, if you want to use the fancy French term, is, as I said, this highly idealized idea of worshipping women. We'll see that, won't we, in the sonnet scene where Romeo refers to Juliet's hand as a holy shrine. It comes from the cult of the Virgin Mary and the idea of women as being ethereal, seraphic, otherworldly, higher morally than men. Now, the problem with this, of course, is if you have an angelic woman, then you can't have physical relations with her. In Romeo and Juliet, we're actually going to see a love that is Platonic in some ways. Romeo and Juliet use all of this Petrarchan imagery, but they're also very physically in love, and Shakespeare makes no bones about it. They have a sexual relationship. So the Petrarchan Lover, what am I going to do on the slide? I'm going to show you that Benvolio says, "Madam, an hour before the worshipped sun peered forth the golden window of the east, a troubled mind drave me to walk abroad, where underneath the grove of the sycamore." I'm putting this in to remind you that the first mention that we have of Romeo is of a man who is in the sycamore grove. Sic amor, again a clever little pun by Shakespeare. Amor meaning love, and sick obviously meaning sick. So Romeo's sick and a diseased love, which comes from the semantic field of love at the time, because love was often seen as a disease. And of course there's this idea that Cupid would shoot you in the eye with his arrow, and then you would sicken because you had fallen in love. So love's seen almost as a kind of virus that weakens you, etc. Montague goes on after Benvolio to say, "Many a morning hath he there been seen, with tears augmenting the fresh morning dew, adding to the clouds more clouds with his deep sighs." Notice the hyperbolic language straight away that's used to introduce Romeo. So the audience are prepared for the Petrarchan Lover even before he arrives. And of course when Romeo does arrive, he uses the extravagant poetry that one would expect of the Petrarchan Lover. Now it's quite amusing to look in the play at the difference between Romeo versus Mercutio, because Mercutio uses the language of the modern day stud, does he not? He is somebody who doesn't in any way believe in kind of chivalry. We see that when he speaks to the nurse and treats her so badly, referring to her as a bawd. Mercutio has a view of love which I think is what we would call a lad's view of love today. Notice in this dialogue, Romeo says, "Is love a tender thing? It is too rough, too rude, too boisterous, and it pricks like a thorn." Again, using this kind of victim imagery, isn't he, for love? And we get used to Romeo using these motifs, these lay motifs. They occur throughout his dialogue, don't they? And Mercutio's reply, again, whenever Mercutio speaks, it's with raw, rough comedy. Mercutio says, "If love be rough with you, be rough with love. Prick love for pricking." No prizes for guessing what the pun is there. He is often using phallic imagery, raw sexual imagery, and this shows the complete difference between the two of them. We know that Mercutio, at the end of the scene, when Romeo disappears to the balcony scene to meet Juliet secretly, Mercutio is very much of the belief that he should be with his friends. He believes in male brotherhood, doesn't he? That women are to be used, that women in many ways are the enemy, that your male friendships are more important. And Romeo, of course, uses all of the extravagant, hyperbolic love language when he applies it to females. Now, I thought just to remind you, I'm not going to go through the whole scene, but you will recall that Shakespeare uses Petrarchan language really cleverly. And if you get the opportunity to address this on the level of form, I want you to remember that the sonnet is a 14-line poem. It was designed never to be published. They were exchanged between friends. It was meant to be a private art form. So what does Shakespeare do? Just to show his stylistic cleverness, he takes a sonnet and he transfers it into dialogue. And I'm going to suggest to you this is incredibly daring and skillful and artful, a difficult thing to do. We begin with Romeo saying to Juliet, "If I do profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine." Do you remember we talked about the semantic field of religion and worship being applied? So that's straight from the Petrarchan tradition. Now you'll see what he's actually doing is he's using the sonnet form. So why does he choose to use a sonnet form at this particular time? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that it captures some incredible magic. Now, this is the thing that is so interesting in Romeo and Juliet, because Shakespeare always uses poetry to put the audience on the side of the characters. And he does this, some of you have seen in Macbeth, when Macbeth's been really bad, when he wants the audience to like Macbeth again, or when he wants the audience to like Hamlet, or when he wants the audience to like Othello, he gives them beautiful poetry, because we listen to the musicality of their words and it generates sympathy. And here I'm going to suggest to you that Shakespeare gives this incredible poetry because he's creating an aura of magic. And I think that this is why Romeo and Juliet is still the ultimate love story. And this scene is one of the absolute archetypal love scenes, is it not? This kind of reverence, this awe, this youthful, uncorrupted, uncontaminated love is so different from the mercenary Elizabethan world of marriage alliances and marrying for money, etc. This is magic, isn't it? This is what guys take their girlfriends to see at the cinema so they can melt their heart, because it is quite manipulative in a way, is it not? So, that's why I urge you not just to say what some of the other teachers are saying, that, all Elizabethans got married without love. I don't believe that to be the case at all. I think there was still, as I say, a strong emerging philosophy of love, and I think Shakespeare is playing upon this, and I think he's drawing upon this. Okay. And of course, don't forget, guys, at the end of the sonnet, there is this incredibly naughty scene here, because they kiss, do they not? And they kiss again, in fact, and they are actually using very religious language, where Romeo says, "Let me take the sin off your lips" again. So you could argue there's quite daring stuff when he says, "Oh, trespass sweetly urge, give me my sin again." Well, in a profoundly Christian age, to ask to be given your sin back is potentially quite wicked. And it shows that there's this whole idea of forbidden fruit that Shakespeare's playing with, and the desirability of forbidden fruit. Now, I want you to see that because of this Petrarchan love, we see that Romeo straight away uses this incredibly extravagant language. And we see this in the speech where he says, "Oh, brawling love, oh, loving hate, oh, anything of nothing first create." Well, I wanted you to see the use of oxymorons, the correct pronunciation. Oh, brawling love, oh, loving hate. At this point, Romeo is so confused by love, or so he says. Is he confused by love? I'm going to suggest to you that one of the ways that you could play Romeo before he meets Juliet as the posturer, as the actor, as the Petrarchan guy who is in love with poetry and his own narrative of suffering, etc. And I'm suggesting that this extravagant language perhaps doesn't ring true. I think later, when he's describing Juliet, you might argue that the poetry is less synthetic, that it appears it's still extravagant, but I don't think it's so recognizably cliched Petrarchan poetry. There's more feeling and authenticity behind the dialogue. And you will recall that at the beginning, when he meets Diane, he describes her as, "She will not be hit with Cupid's arrow. She has Diane's wit." Diane was the goddess of the moon, the virgin goddess, a very powerful female goddess who would actually laugh at male love and reject it. Now, is this actually true or not? Well, once again, I'm going to suggest to you, I think that Romeo is enjoying the role rather than truly being in love at this particular point. And I want you to see, this is something I haven't shown you before. It's quite interesting. This is Sonnet 130 by Shakespeare. Many believe that this is his greatest sonnet. In it, he writes a sonnet where he says, "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun." He goes on worse to say that, "And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks." Now that's not very nice, is it? So when he did his, French kiss, his snog, he was actually snogging someone whose breath reeked, okay? Now you might think that this is really insulting, but it seems to me very interesting that Shakespeare is deliberately rejecting the idea that you need to idolize women. And he's actually implicitly highly critical of this hyperbolic Petrarchan language. And look at the rhyming couplet at the end. "And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare." In other words, Shakespeare is very aware of the fact that poets are always exaggerating how beautiful and amazing and virgin-like and extraordinary their mistresses are, how they have snow cheeks with damask rose in them, etc., etc. And this is the idea of false compare. So we know from this sonnet that Shakespeare could be very critical of this false compare, this Petrarchan language. However, in Romeo and Juliet, we know that he does use it to great effect as well. So it can be quite confusing and quite ambiguous. Now, I think that this is also an interesting slide, okay? Because Romeo here says, I fear too early, for my mind misgives. Some consequence yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful fate with this night's revel, and expire the term of a despised life closed in my breast. Okay? Now, here you'll see that Romeo is putting everything down to fate. But I wanted to remind you, yes, the Elizabethans are very superstitious. But let's not forget, as he speaks these lines, guess where he's going? He's going to his family's greatest enemy. He's going to sneak in wearing a visor. Now, is that fate or is that bad judgment? Now, I do think an Elizabethan audience might actually recognize that it can't entirely be put down to fate. Because once again, I want you to remember this is Elizabethan. It's not medieval. Yes, there's still the belief in fate. But there is again an emerging philosophy that the individual controls his fate. So that's quite an interesting point, I think. Yeah. Now, how does this scene that I've got on the slide now reveal the dangers of an idealistic love? Okay. Well, here's Romeo speaking. Oh, she does teach the torches to burn bright. It seems that she hangs upon the cheek of night like a rich jewel in the Ethiop's ear. Okay, we've talked a little bit about this before, and putting the racism aside, I think we can talk about it as the kind of juxtaposition of light and dark colors, okay, and this extraordinary vision. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you is that while Shakespeare's shows that Romeo is putting all of his effort into his beautiful poetry, what's going on? Well, let's look below. Tybalt, this by his voice shall be a Montague. Fetch me my rapier, boy. What dares this slave come hither, covered with an antic face? Antic here means mask, okay? So what gave Romeo away? His language and this outburst of passion and love and poetry. You will notice, of course, that Shakespeare structures it very cleverly to show that Romeo is entirely unaware of where he is. He's in the public sphere. He's in a public area. He's in his enemy's house. But he's lost in thought, isn't he? And this is the thing about Romeo, is he doesn't live in the world. So what's Shakespeare telling us about love? Shakespeare's telling us that love can actually seal you off from the world. It can make you live in your own head. It can make you live in your own poetry. And as a result of that, you lack survival skills. You lack worldly skills. And that seems to be what's happening in this particular scene. In terms of marriage, I want to remind you that Capulet begins by saying, my child is a stranger to the world. And he says, let 2 more summers wither in their pride. We've said we find this a very modern, loving attitude. Juliet is his only daughter, after all. Let's not forget, however, that Capulet then says, fettle your fine joints against next Thursday, to go with Paris to St. Peter's Church, or I will drag you on a hurdle hither. A hurdle is the way they tortured Christian saints, breaking their back. So he's basically saying, listen, girl, I will torture you to death. He calls her baggage, as we've said before, which in many ways would be the equivalent of calling her a slut, a harlot, a piece of trash, junk. So it's an incredibly jarring word, isn't it? And if we look at those 2 speeches next to each other, it's very dramatic. However, I want to warn you that Capulet would not necessarily be seen as a terrible, abusive father to Elizabethans. After all, Julia is disobeying him in that highly patriarchal society that I described earlier. Now, infatuation, I've gone into this a little bit, but I just want to say one thing more, and that is that, again, I think that one of the key things is that Shakespeare represents love as beautiful, as sacrificing, but he also represents infatuation as very disturbing and causing people to make bad judgments. The Elizabethan religion, I'm not going to say too much of this because you can read the slide yourself, But I wanted you to remember, of course, that this was a much, much more religious society than modern Western countries. However, the play is set in Catholic Europe. And so when we have criticism of Friar Lawrence, that's not criticism of Christianity, it is criticism of Catholicism. And by this stage, you have England at war with the Catholic countries. The Armada actually tried to invade England to destroy the Protestant church. So the Protestant church tended to be very anti-Catholic at this particular time. Now, I'm going to say one other thing about suicide, because this is very interesting. You all remember, of course, that the Elizabethans who killed themselves were not seen as victims. They were not buried in hallowed ground in a normal grave. They were seen as committing a mortal sin, and their souls were seen as damned forever. You were excluded from God's grace, okay? And it was commonly held that the devil himself often drove people to self-destruction. So it was seen as an act of the devil. However, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, of why it's different in Romeo and Juliet. I'm going to deal with this very quickly and just show you that in Elizabethan times they had a psychology, a theory of psychology. They believed in the humours. So they believed that we were controlled by yellow bile, by blood, by phlegm, and by black bile. You will recall that often the word phlegm or phlegmatic is used for English people. That means calm, okay? Like Benvolio is a phlegmatic individual, okay? Blood was often associated with youth and with sexuality. So we can see maybe Romeo as blood. And choler came from yellow bile. And hence today we still use the term choleric, don't we? A choleric disposition means a fighting, angry disposition. And I think we could see that as Tybalt, and to some extent Mercutio too. And black bile was associated with the idea of melancholia or depression. So you could see why the lover might go from blood to black bile, from the idea of like sort of infatuation and sexuality to terrible depression. So I wanted you to see that Shakespeare was operating within a theory of psychology. Today that might seem ridiculous, but in those days, this is how they saw personality types, okay? Tybalt, the choleric. What? Drawn and talk of peace? I hate the word, as I hate Hal, all Montagues and thee. Have it thee, coward. So, Tybalt is the ultimate macho man. He comes out of the dueling Italian tradition, doesn't he? Mercutio, you'll recall, his name comes from Mercury, who is the messenger of the god. But Mercury is an unstable metal. It's why it's used in thermometers, isn't it? It moves up and down. So Mercutio, we can see, is quite a disturbing character. You'll recall in the Queen Mab speech, do you remember this? That he goes on a crazy tirade. It begins as a piece of fantasy and imagination, and in the end he's shouting. And Romeo has to say to him, peace, thou speaks of nothing. Do you recall that? Baz Luhrmann, in the modern interpretation of the film, has him take ecstasy. Do you remember that? Because he wants to show why he's become so deranged. So Mercutio, it's very important to remember him as the mercurial individual. So dueling, what do we need to know about dueling? Well, Shakespeare's great contemporary, Ben Jonson, killed a man and was charged with manslaughter. England had less dueling than Italy because, as I said, they tended to be more peaceful, more phlegmatic by nature. However, there were examples of dueling. But we are at the stage where dueling begins to be looked down upon as being savage and tribal, etc. And I'm going to suggest to you that Romeo and Juliet shows dueling in a very negative light. What do you think? Tybalt is actually an aggressive belligerent. He causes trouble, doesn't he? And we see that this obsession with masculine honor is represented in quite a negative way. So we could argue that Shakespeare is part of the modern trend to try to move away from the thuggery of dueling and this whole cult of masculinity, etc. So this move away happens because dueling is from the medieval world. And as society becomes more technical, as we have proper laws, then we move away from this idea of just settling things in the court. However, as you know from Frankenstein, right until the 19th century, there are still elements of mob justice that occur. What I'm suggesting is that Romeo and Juliet shows mob justice in quite a negative way. And so much so that it actually leads to civil war. What's the greatest problem in Verona? The greatest problem in Verona is the fighting between the two households, the Montagues and the Capulets. What is the origin of that? Well, that's what I said to you. Bred of an airy word. Again, this seems to be attacking this idea of masculine honor, this code in which you have to savagely revenge anything that imputes the honor of your family. But this gives you context for Juliet's speech. What's in a name? Very romantic, isn't it? Where she actually says, why don't you change your name? Okay? Which she says something that is actually very false logic, yeah? Where she actually says, oh, be some other name. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. It's actually a false, illogical argument, isn't it? Can you change your name? No. So this relates to the whole idea of duty versus the individual. Juliet here is giving up all duty, all public duty, all duty to her family. Now, to Elizabethans, this would be heresy, because they were bred to believe in the honor of their family name. They were bred to believe that they were not simply individuals. So one of the things that the play explores is the conflict between individual and the community. And so here we see Romeo and Juliet, both of them abandoning their families and believing that the individual can follow their own desires. Today that would be much more acceptable, would it not, than in their day. Here is the coat of arms. I was absolutely stunned to find that my own Tinker Irish family have a coat of arms. And I thought I would just put it up just to remind you of the way in which in Romeo and Juliet's time you would be thinking not simply of yourself, but the honor of your family, the advantage of your household. Going back to suicide, I should have put these slides in better order. Suicide in ancient Greece and Rome did not have the stigma that it had in Christian society. In fact, like Japan, it was often seen as quite a valiant way out. Romans would rather fall upon their sword than be taken prisoner. However, in the Christian Islamic tradition, this is often seen as a terrible thing because life is seen as a gift from God, something which is very sacred. But let's not forget that tragedy is not a Christian genre. Tragedy is actually an ancient Greek genre, is it not? Which is why we have the references to stars and fate and superstition and the gods. And the denouement of tragedy, if it isn't murder or killing, it is often suicide. So in Romeo and Juliet, rather than going with the Christian tradition that Romeo and Juliet would be buried in unhallowed ground and be thrown aside and be seen as damned, we actually see, don't we, Montague saying, "For I will raise her statue in pure gold, that while Verona by that name is known, there shall no figure at such rate be set as that of true and faithful Juliet." So Capulet here is going to raise Montague here is going to raise the statue to his enemy's daughter. Now let's not forget, however, that this is within the genre of tragedy. Is it realistic? No, of course it's not. Okay? Would he really raise a statue to a girl who married his son without anyone's permission? Probably most unlikely. Okay? So it is a piece of literature. It's poetic love, isn't it? Rather than it being realistic love. Motherhood we've talked about. And once again, I just want to remind you not to judge too harshly when Lady Capulet says, "Here, Verona, ladies of esteem are made already mothers. By my count, I was your mother much upon these years, that you are now a maid." So again, I'm putting that in because I think a lot of girls today, when we teach this play, are quite horrified at the idea that someone's trying to get their daughter married off at the age of 13. Paris also says, "Younger than she are happy mothers made." But I think that makes us dislike Paris, as I said. Because even though that did occur, once again, you're having a changing view in society. There is a kind of what we would call progress today towards women's rights. Okay, the dangers of corporeal love. Corporeal means bodily or physical love. Friar Lawrence warns us, these violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder. Now that's quite interesting, as we've said before, that the friar warns them, because he warns them just as he's about to marry them, doesn't he? So in some ways we have the traditional Christian view there that sexuality is a bad thing. You've got it there blowing up and exploding and being dangerous and all this violent imagery. But look at this. Here is Juliet speaking. She's waiting for her wedding night, for the consummation of her marriage, to make love to her new husband. Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, towards Phoebus's lodging. Notice the frigative Fs, they are meant to show her frustration and her impatience, yeah? And she goes on to say, look here, lovers leap to these arms, untalked of and unseen. Lovers can see to do their amorous rites, in other words, make love, have sex, by their own beauties. Very interesting that Shakespeare chooses to show female sexual desire so openly. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that Romeo and Juliet's love is not merely platonic, is it? It is actually a mixture of the physical and the spiritual. And maybe that's what makes it a kind of ideal love, as opposed to the love that Romeo has for Rosaline at the beginning, which is the unrequited love that comes from the Petrarchan tradition. Juliet also says, give me my Romeo, and when he shall die. Now some of you will know that die is actually a pun for orgasm. So again, naughty stuff, and probably not something that we need to write about in the exam. However, the nurse speaks extremely and flagrantly sexually, and that's because, generally speaking, in Shakespeare, and I'm sure you've noticed this, when the common characters come on, and I hope I don't sound snobby saying that, I'm using that in the Shakespearean sense, usually they are associated with common diction and also with comic vulgarity. They are there for the jokes. Why are they there for the jokes? Have a look at the theatre, please, guys, on the screen now. Can I remind you that much of the theatre stood up for the full 3.5 hours? They were called groundlings, and they were in the pit, this section here. Many of them were drinking. They were rowdy. Did they have the ability to concentrate on complex metrical verse? Absolutely not. So you'll see in Shakespeare that they're often comic interludes. And therefore, when the nurse comes on, the diction is actually quite vulgar, and all the audience then can raucously laugh and enjoy the sexual puns. Here the nurse says, my lord and you were then at Mantua, nay, I do bear a brain. But as I said, when it did taste, she's talking about Juliet, the wormwood on the nipple, because the nurse fed her, breastfed her. In those days, posh women didn't breastfeed, just a bit like today in Dubai. But in this case, they actually hired what they called a wet nurse, a nurse who would breastfeed the children for them. Well, the nurse is here discussing in detail how she put this kind of horrible bitter poison on her nipple so that Juliet would hate it, and that's how they weaned children in those days. If you read this scene in context, you'll see the nurse has gone off on a crazy one. It's got nothing to do with what they should be talking about now. So the nurse constantly digresses. She is there for comic relief. She talks a lot of nonsense. She's there as a kind of joke. She's also vulgar. And then my husband, God be with his soul, her husband's died. I was a merry man. Notice the way she always digresses and loses her point. Took up the child. Yea, quoth he, dost thou fall upon thy face? Thou wilt fall backward when thou hast more wit. So what the husband's saying is, you've fallen forward this time, but when you get married, you're going to be thrown on your back and taken that way. Okay? So he's making a very vulgar and rather sexual, vulgar joke about sexuality. Another time we see it is when the nurse says, now by my maidenhead, her virginity, at 12-year-old, in other words, I had my virginity till I was 12, and she's boasting about that. Okay? So again, I think it's meant to be like comic relief within the play. So the nurse, she speaks about sexuality in a much more vulgar way. Shakespeare gives us an insight into the fact that common people aren't doing all this extravagant poetry and stuff, are they? They've just got a much more down-to-earth and practical attitude towards love and sexuality and motherhood. Okay. And that's perhaps why Mercutio treats the nurse so rudely. He describes her as a bawd. One of the meanings of bawd is someone who keeps a brothel. And the nurse says, "Out upon you, what a man are you?" And then the nurse complains, very amusingly, "And thou must stand by too, and suffer every knave to use me at his pleasure." Of course, what the nurse means by that is, you just stood there and let people speak to me in any way that you wanted, in any way they wanted. And of course, the audience will see the pun, and it also means, and you just stood there and let this guy use me, have sex with me, and you didn't do anything. So there's all of this kind of comic sexual punning that runs through the play. Now I'm going to finish off now, so don't worry. So is this a tragedy that celebrates religious love? I'm going to suggest to you it's very ambiguous, because like all tragedies, the lovers die. So you could say it's a cautionary tale. But however, there's no doubt in our minds that it's a celebration of Romeo and Juliet's love, and it's seen as kind of idealistic in many ways, isn't it? Like too good for this world. So it's within the genre of romance too. It's seen as a beautiful thing. And today Romeo and Juliet is used as an archetypal story of ideal spiritual love, is it not? So in a sense, Shakespeare does seem to be celebrating rebellion. On the other hand, of course, it does end in tragedy. So it's hard to know exactly, and I'm going to suggest to you it's a very ambivalent message. What is clear is that only love is the thing that heals the rift between the Montagues and the Capulets. And that love of sacrifice and self-sacrifice actually buries the enmity. So in a way, it's not tragedy for no thing. Now, at one stage it looked like Romeo and Juliet abandoned their families for selfish reasons, for personal desire. But ironically, at the end of the play, they heal the rifts between the two families, and their rebellion actually produces greater social stability. And that's the paradox of the play.